They say money talks, but in the spring of 2021, when $10 billion suddenly went silent, the screaming started. Picture this: a kid from a melon farm in the flatlands of Bundaberg, Australia, spins a story about helping small businesses get paid faster. Noble, right? The kind of thing that gets you a meeting with the Prime Minister, maybe even gets you a desk at 10 Downing Street, a business card with a government email address, access to 11 departments, the keys to the kingdom. Now picture that same kid, 2 decades later, stepping off his private jet, tail number MGFGC, onto a tarmac in Zurich. In his briefcase, invoices for trades that never happened, loans backed by money that didn't exist yet, a financial house of cards built on the revolutionary principle that if you dress up garbage in enough fancy packaging and get enough important people to vouch for it, you can sell it to anyone. By March 2021, Greensill Capital, the fintech darling that promised to democratize finance, was owing £2.7 billion to creditors. The company that SoftBank had valued at $7 billion couldn't make payroll. The firm that had former Prime Minister David Cameron on speed dial couldn't get a loan. The operation that had wooed Credit Suisse into handing over $10 billion of client money was filing for insolvency. This is the story of Lex Greensill, the smooth-talking Australian who convinced bankers, billionaires, and the British government that he'd invented the future of finance. This is the story of how supply chain financing became a Ponzi scheme dressed in Silicon Valley clothes. This is the story of matching private jets, fake invoices, and a lobbying scandal that reached straight into the heart of British power. This is the story of what happens when ego meets opportunity, when innovation becomes fraud, and when everyone's getting rich except the people holding the bag at the end. Welcome to Greensill Capital, where the money was always moving, the books never quite balanced, and nobody asked questions until it was far, far too late. Let's pull back the curtain. Lex Greensill learned about cash flow the hard way, watching his parents sweat over bills while watermelons rotted in the Australian sun. The Greensill farm wasn't making them rich. Sugarcane and melons don't pay immediately. You plant, you harvest, you ship, and then you wait. 30 days, 60 days, sometimes 90. The buyers always had payment terms, and those terms meant the Greensill family lived on hope and overdrafts. Young Lex watched his mother worry over the kitchen table, calculator in hand, trying to stretch money that wouldn't arrive for months. He saw opportunity in that anxiety, a problem to solve, a market inefficiency that, if corrected, could make someone very, very wealthy. He was ambitious, smart, the kind of kid who knew he wasn't staying in Bundaberg. By his early 20s, he'd made it to Sydney, then London, landing at Morgan Stanley just as the financial world was discovering exotic new ways to package and sell debt. At Morgan Stanley, Greensill specialized in supply chain finance, the unglamorous business of helping companies pay their suppliers faster by having a bank or financier step in as an intermediary. Simple concept. A company owes money to suppliers but doesn't want to pay immediately. A financier pays the supplier right away, then collects from the company later, plus a fee. Everybody wins. Suppliers get cash, companies keep their money longer, financiers collect interest. Nothing revolutionary. Banks had been doing it for centuries. But Lex Greensill saw something others didn't. He saw scale. He saw technology. He saw a world where supply chain finance wasn't a boring backwater product for a handful of large corporations. It was a massive, untapped market worth trillions. And he saw himself becoming very rich by being the man who unlocked it. In 2011, Lex Greensill walked out of Morgan Stanley and founded Greensill Capital. His pitch was seductive. We're not a bank, we're a fintech. We use technology to make supply chain finance accessible to everyone, from massive corporations down to that melon farmer in Bundaberg who can't wait 90 days to get paid. He had the pedigree, the charm, the story, and he had timing. This was the era when anything with tech attached to it could raise millions from investors who were terrified of missing the next big thing. But here's what Greensill really understood. Supply chain finance lives in a regulatory gray zone. It's not quite a loan, it's not quite trading. It doesn't show up on balance sheets the same way traditional debt does, and because it's not technically a loan, it doesn't require the same level of regulatory scrutiny as traditional banking. Perfect. The business model was straightforward on paper. Greensill would pay suppliers on behalf of big companies, take a small fee, then collect from those companies when payment was due. To fund these payments, Greensill would bundle up all those receivables, the money companies owed, and sell them to investors through funds managed by partner banks like Credit Suisse. Investors loved it. The returns were decent, the risk seemed low. These were invoices from real companies for real goods. What could go wrong? Everything, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. By 2015, Greensill Capital was growing fast. The company was handling billions in financing. Lex Greensill was jet-setting between London, New York, and Sydney. More importantly, he was networking his way into the corridors of power. This is where the story gets interesting, and where David Cameron enters the picture. But first, Greensill needed political legitimacy. He needed access, he needed someone to open doors, and he knew exactly how to get it. 10 Downing Street, London, 2012.
Picture a meeting room in the heart of British government. David Cameron, the Prime Minister, sits across from a man he's just been introduced by a mutual contact. The man is Australian, well-dressed, articulate. He's talking about revolutionizing government procurement, about helping small businesses, about using private sector innovation to make public services more efficient. The man is Lex Greensill, and he's about to get everything he wants. Greensill's pitch was brilliant in its simplicity. He told Cameron and his team that government suppliers, pharmacies, medical equipment companies, small contractors, all had the same problem the melon farmer had. They did work for the government and then waited months to get paid. What if there was a way to pay them faster, without the government having to change its payment schedules? What if a private company, say Greensill Capital, could step in and pay suppliers immediately, then collect from the government later? Cameron loved it. It was the kind of public-private partnership his government championed. It looked like innovation, it appeared to help small businesses, and it cost the government nothing upfront. There was one tiny detail that perhaps didn't get enough scrutiny. Greensill Capital, the company proposing this solution, would make money every time it facilitated a payment. The more the scheme was used, the wealthier Lex Greensill would become. But nobody seemed to worry about that. In 2012, Lex Greensill was made a Crown representative, an unpaid advisor to the government with extraordinary access. He got a Downing Street email address, a government phone number, a business card that said he was a senior advisor to the Prime Minister, access to 11 different government departments. For a financier trying to sell supply chain finance services, this was pure gold. Over the next few years, Greensill worked his magic. The pharmacy scheme launched. NHS trusts started using Greensill services. Local councils got involved. Government departments were encouraging suppliers to sign up for early payment programs run through Greensill Capital. It was all perfectly legal. Greensill wasn't technically lobbying, he was an advisor. He wasn't selling to the government, they were just facilitating payments. The fact that his company profited handsomely from each transaction was, well, incidental. At the 2017 birthday honors, Lex Greensill was made a Commander of the Order of the British Empire, a CBE, for services to the economy. Prince Charles handed him the medal. By 2018, Greensill Capital was being valued at over $3 billion. SoftBank's Vision Fund had invested $1.5 billion. The company was preparing for a potential IPO that could value it at $7 billion. And that's when David Cameron, who'd left office in 2016 after the Brexit referendum, got a phone call. The details of how David Cameron came to work for Greensill Capital remain somewhat murky. Cameron claims the idea of working for Greensill was never raised or considered by me until well after I left office. Others suggest the relationship had been carefully cultivated for years. What's clear is this. In 2018, 2 years after leaving Downing Street, conveniently, just after the 2-year period when he was required to seek approval for private sector jobs, David Cameron became an advisor to Greensill Capital. His compensation package was extraordinary. Documents obtained by the BBC's Panorama showed Cameron earned around £7 million from salary and selling shares. Reports suggested he was being paid over £1 million a year for about 25 days of work. He held share options that could have been worth up to £60 million if the company went public as planned. What did Cameron do for this money? He lobbied, he opened doors, he made introductions. He brought Lex Greensill to meet Matt Hancock, the health secretary. Some NHS trusts subsequently signed up for Greensill services. He reportedly introduced Greensill to Barack Obama, helping expand the company's network in America.
He attended board meetings regularly. He was, by all accounts, deeply involved in the business. Cameron was doing for Greensill Capital what Greensill had once done inside government, lending credibility, opening doors, making the improbable seem legitimate. But there were problems, big problems that would eventually bring the whole house of cards crashing down. The main problem had a name, Sanjeev Gupta. But before we meet Mr. Gupta, there's something you need to understand about Greensill's business model, because what Lex Greensill told investors and what Greensill Capital actually did were two very different things. Two private jets streak across the sky, heading from London to New York. The tail numbers are MGFGC and METAL, matching jets, owned by best friends and business partners. In one jet, Lex Greensill, the fintech golden boy, heading to meet with Credit Suisse about expanding the supply chain funds they're marketing to wealthy clients. In the other, Sanjeev Gupta, the so-called savior of British steel, who's been on a buying spree, snapping up failing steel plants and aluminum smelters across Europe and Australia. These men are not just friends. They are symbiotically linked in a financial arrangement so close, so incestuous, that when one falls, the other will be dragged down with him. Gupta's GFG Alliance, a loose collection of companies involved in steel, aluminum, and commodities trading, is Greensill's biggest client. Over half of Greensill's business comes from financing Gupta's operations. The exposure is massive, $5 billion. Now, here's where things get ugly.
Remember that simple supply chain finance model? Pay suppliers now, collect from companies later. That's supposed to be based on real invoices for real goods that have already been delivered. Low risk, boring, predictable. But Greensill and Gupta had evolved beyond such pedestrian concepts. They had invented something called future receivables financing. Let me explain what that actually means. Traditional supply chain finance works like this. A supplier delivers goods, an invoice is generated. Greensill pays the supplier. Greensill collects from the company when the invoice is due. But what if there's no invoice yet? What if the goods haven't been delivered? What if, in fact, the customer doesn't even exist yet? Welcome to future receivables. Greensill would finance Gupta's companies based on sales they projected they might make to customers they hoped to do business with in the future. These weren't real invoices. They were speculative, fictional, a bet that trades would happen and companies would pay. It gets worse. According to court documents and administrator reports, some of the invoices Greensill used as backing for these loans listed companies that, when contacted, denied ever doing business with Gupta's operations at all. The Financial Times found multiple instances where Liberty Commodities, one of Gupta's trading companies, had submitted invoices to Greensill claiming to have sold nickel, steel, or other metals to companies that had never even heard of Liberty Commodities. Gupta's explanation? These were prospective customers. Greensill had approved them for future trading. The invoices were just aspirational. In other words, Greensill was lending billions based on invoices for trades that never happened with customers that didn't exist. And here's the beautiful part, from Greensill and Gupta's perspective anyway. This money would then be bundled up and sold to investors through Credit Suisse's supply chain funds. Wealthy investors, pension funds, people who thought they were buying low-risk investments backed by real invoices from real companies. They were actually buying Sanjeev Gupta's fever dreams. The relationship between Greensill and Gupta went deeper than just financing, much deeper. Gupta wasn't just a client, he was effectively keeping Greensill alive. And Greensill was keeping Gupta's empire from collapsing under the weight of all the debt-fueled acquisitions. When Gupta bought Arium, the failing Australian steelworks, he needed Greensill's financing to keep operations running. When he acquired plants from ArcelorMittal in Europe, a deal that required him to invest more of his own money and take on less debt, Greensill structured creative financing arrangements to make the numbers work for regulators. Gupta even lent Gupta money personally. Credit Suisse, which marketed the supply chain funds, also gave Gupta's companies credit lines. They financed his £42 million Belgravia townhouse purchase. They rolled out the red carpet when Gupta visited Zurich. They invited him to St. Moritz's exclusive white turf polo tournament. Everyone was making money, or at least everyone thought they were making money. The reality was darker. Gupta's companies were burning through cash. Many of the steel plants and smelters he'd acquired were loss-making operations that needed constant infusions of capital.
The business model, if you could call it that, was to keep growing, keep acquiring, and keep borrowing until economies of scale magically made everything profitable.
Greensill's business model was equally precarious. The company needed constant growth to maintain its valuations. Every time Greensill facilitated a payment, it took a fee. But to make real money, it needed to scale massively. That meant lending more, faster, to bigger clients. The fact that one client, Gupta, represented over half the business should have been a screaming red flag. If Gupta's companies hit trouble, Greensill would be in immediate danger. German regulators noticed. In mid-December 2020, BaFin, Germany's financial watchdog, urged Greensill Bank, the German subsidiary, to reduce its exposure to a single customer. Lex Greensill's response, that was going to be impossible for us to comply with. Translation, we're too dependent on Gupta to pull back now. By early 2021, the house of cards was starting to tilt. But Greensill and Gupta had one more trick up their sleeves, one more desperate play, and it required calling in a favor from someone with direct access to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. When COVID-19 hit Britain, the economy went into cardiac arrest. Businesses closed, supply chains seized up. The government scrambled to prevent mass bankruptcies with emergency lending schemes. One program was called the COVID Corporate Financing Facility, the CCFF. It was designed to help large creditworthy companies survive the lockdown by allowing them to borrow from the government at favorable rates. The Bank of England would essentially buy short-term debt from qualifying companies, giving them immediate cash. For Greensill Capital, this looked like a lifeline. If they could get Gupta's companies into the CCFF, it would provide a stamp of approval, government backing for operations that private insurers were increasingly nervous about. There was just one problem. Greensill and Gupta's companies didn't qualify. That's when David Cameron picked up his phone. Between April and June 2020, as Britain was in lockdown and the government was dealing with the public health crisis, David Cameron lobbied intensely to get Greensill Capital access to government support schemes. He sent text messages to Chancellor Rishi Sunak, lots of them, more than 70 emails and texts to various officials. He even got Sunak's personal mobile number, something normally very difficult for private sector lobbyists to obtain, and texted him directly. One text, reportedly signed off with Love DC, pleaded for Greensill to be included in the CCFF program. Cameron also contacted other senior Treasury officials. He argued that Greensill was vital to keeping supply chains functioning during the pandemic, that small businesses depended on them, that denying them access could cause economic damage. What he didn't emphasize was that he personally stood to make tens of millions if Greensill survived and went public, or that Greensill was dangerously overexposed to a single client whose financial stability was increasingly questionable. The Treasury said no. Greensill didn't meet the eligibility criteria. The CCFF was for large companies that issued commercial paper, short-term debt traded in public markets. Greensill's financing arrangements didn't qualify. Undeterred, Cameron and Greensill tried another route. There was a separate scheme called CLBILS, the COVID Large Business Interruption Loan Scheme, run by the British Business Bank. Unlike the CCFF, CLBILS provided government-backed loans through private lenders. This time, they got in. Greensill was accredited as a lender under CLBILS. Over the following months, the British Business Bank, a government-owned institution, lent Greensill up to £400 million with an 80% government guarantee. That meant if Greensill couldn't repay, British taxpayers would be on the hook for 80% of the loss.
Here's where it gets even worse. Greensill turned around and lent all of that money, all £400 million, to 8 different companies linked to Sanjeev Gupta. So taxpayer money, meant to support businesses during a pandemic, was being funneled directly to Greensill's biggest and riskiest client, the same client whose invoices administrators would later be unable to verify. The National Audit Office would eventually warn that taxpayers could lose all of it, a potential £335 million loss. But in mid-2020, nobody was asking tough questions. The economy was in crisis. Greensill had a former prime minister vouching for them. Credit Suisse was still marketing billions in Greensill-backed funds to investors. SoftBank's $1.5 billion investment provided credibility. Everything looked fine, on paper anyway. Except everything wasn't fine. Behind the scenes, cracks were forming. In July 2020, a group of insurers, led by Tokyo Marine Management, companies that had been providing credit insurance for Greensill's financing operations, made a decision that would prove fatal. They announced they would not renew Greensill's insurance coverage when the policies expired. This was a death sentence. Here's why. When Greensill financed companies like Gupta's operations, it needed insurance to protect against defaults. If a company couldn't pay its invoices, the insurer would cover the loss. This protection was essential for selling those invoices to investors. Credit Suisse wouldn't market funds without insurance backing. So when Tokyo Marine pulled out, Greensill's entire business model collapsed. Why did they pull out? According to reports, the insurers had become increasingly concerned about Greensill's relationship with Gupta. They'd seen the press reports about questionable invoices. They'd heard whispers from German regulators who were investigating. They'd looked at the concentration risk, one client representing over half the business, and decided they didn't want exposure.
Greensill desperately tried to find replacement insurance. They failed. No insurer would touch them. By February 2021, the situation was critical. Credit Suisse, seeing that insurance coverage was expiring, began to panic. Without insurance, the $10 billion in supply chain funds they'd marketed to clients were suddenly high-risk investments. On March 1, 2021, Credit Suisse suspended the funds. Redemptions were frozen. Billions of dollars belonging to Credit Suisse's wealthy clients were trapped in Greensill-backed investments. The next week was chaos. Without Credit Suisse's funding, Greensill had no money to pay suppliers. The business model, pay suppliers now, collect later, requires constant cash flow. When that spigot turned off, everything stopped. Greensill frantically tried to find a buyer. Apollo Global Management and Athene Holdings were approached about acquiring the operating business. Negotiations moved quickly. This was life or death. But potential buyers kept looking at the books and walking away. The assets, those receivables backing everything, weren't worth what Greensill claimed. Too much of it was tied up in Gupta's companies. Too many invoices couldn't be verified. Too much of the future receivables were speculative fiction. On March 8, 2021, Greensill Capital filed for insolvency protection in London. The same day, Germany's BaFin shut down Greensill Bank, the German subsidiary, citing serious balance sheet irregularities and potential violations of banking regulations. The matching jets, MGFGC and METAL, would never fly together again. But the real pain was just beginning, because when Greensill died, it took down everything and everyone connected to it. Imagine you're a wealthy Credit Suisse client. You've invested in what you were told were ultra-safe supply chain finance funds, low risk, steady returns. Your money is financing invoices from real companies for real goods. Now imagine waking up to find your money, millions of dollars, is frozen, trapped in a fund that's invested heavily in a company that just went bankrupt. And that company was primarily financing another company whose invoices may not even be real. Credit Suisse had marketed approximately $10 billion worth of Greensill supply chain finance funds to its wealth management clients. Those funds were now suspended. Redemptions frozen. The bank warned investors they faced significant losses. Credit Suisse's own risk and compliance officers resigned. The bank faced billions in potential losses, not just from the supply chain funds, but from direct lending to Greensill. They'd lent Greensill $190 million personally. They'd given Gupta credit lines. They'd financed his real estate purchases. The Swiss bank had drunk the Kool-Aid completely. They'd made Greensill a one-bank client, giving him access to wealth management, investment banking, personal banking, everything. They'd taken him to the St. Moritz polo tournament, given him VIP treatment. Now they were hiring Kroll, a private investigation firm, to track down Gupta's assets around the world so they could try to recover something, anything, from the wreckage. The total damage to Credit Suisse from Greensill and a separate scandal involving Archegos Capital, over $6 billion in losses. Heads rolled. The chief risk officer resigned. The head of investment banking resigned. But Credit Suisse's pain was just the beginning. In Britain, the scandal exploded into the political realm with a force that surprised everyone. The Sunday Times and Financial Times started digging. What they found made headlines for months. David Cameron, it turned out, had lobbied the government more than 70 times on Greensill's behalf. He'd texted the Chancellor directly. He'd contacted multiple ministers. He'd used every connection, every relationship, every bit of influence he'd built over decades in politics to help a private company. A company that was paying him over £1 million a year and in which he held share options worth potentially £60 million. The optics were devastating. A former prime minister who'd once given speeches about cracking down on lobbying and ending the cozy relationship between politics, government, business, and money was now the poster boy for exactly that cozy relationship. Cameron had to testify before Parliament. The sight of a former prime minister being grilled by MPs about his lobbying activities was unprecedented. He was defensive, claiming he'd broken no rules, that his advocacy was based on genuine belief in Greensill's business model. But the Treasury Committee report was brutal. They found Cameron had shown a significant lack of judgment. The current lobbying rules had insufficient strength. While he hadn't technically broken any laws, conveniently because he'd waited until after the 2-year cooling-off period to take the job, his behavior had been inappropriate. Prime Minister Boris Johnson ordered a full inquiry. The Cabinet Office investigation, led by Nigel Boardman, found that Jeremy Haywood, the former cabinet secretary who had since died, was primarily responsible for giving Lex Greensill such extraordinary access to government while Cameron was prime minister. Haywood had allowed Greensill to operate as a government advisor while simultaneously running a company that profited from government contracts. It was a massive conflict of interest that nobody had properly scrutinized. The inquiry also found that Bill Crothers, the UK government's chief commercial officer from 2012-2015, had become an advisor to Greensill while still a civil servant. He'd never declared this to ethics watchdogs. He'd never sought approval. He'd just done it. When he left government in 2016, he became a director of Greensill Capital. The revolving door had spun so smoothly, nobody even noticed until after the collapse. But political scandal was just the appetizer. The main course was criminal investigation. In May 2022, the UK's Serious Fraud Office announced they were launching a criminal investigation into GFG Alliance. The investigation covered suspected fraud, fraudulent trading, and money laundering in relation to the financing and conduct of the business, including financing arrangements with Greensill Capital. Sanjeev Gupta, the steel magnate who'd been hailed as the savior of British industry, was now a suspect in a fraud investigation. In Switzerland, Lex Greensill himself was named as a suspect in a criminal case alongside Swiss bankers. Prosecutors were investigating whether fraudulent information had been provided to Credit Suisse about the quality and legitimacy of the receivables backing those supply chain funds. In Germany, regulators were investigating the collapse of Greensill Bank and the loss of hundreds of millions deposited by local German councils who thought they were making safe investments. In Australia, where Gupta's Whyalla Steel Works employed thousands, the government of South Australia was forced to put the operation into administration in February 2025 due to unpaid debts exceeding $300 million. The investigations are still ongoing. As of late 2024, David Cameron's activities at Greensill were reported to be a matter of interest in the Serious Fraud Office investigation, though he has not been accused of any wrongdoing. But statistics and investigations don't capture the real damage. Thousands of steel workers across Britain, Europe, and Australia watched their jobs disappear or hang by a thread because the financing that kept their plants running had evaporated. The aluminum smelter at Fort William in Scotland, the Whyalla Steelworks in South Australia, steel plants across France and Germany, all teetering because Gupta's empire was built on loans he couldn't repay. Pension funds that had invested in those safe Credit Suisse supply chain funds, they lost billions. That's retired teachers, nurses, public servants whose pensions took hits because their fund managers believed Greensill's story. Small businesses that had signed up for Greensill's early payment services found themselves in limbo, unsure if they'd get paid at all. British taxpayers were left holding the bag for the £335 million that Greensill had lent to Gupta's companies using government-backed loans. Money that was supposed to help businesses survive COVID had instead propped up a failing steel empire. And Credit Suisse's wealthy clients, people who trusted the bank's reputation and due diligence, learned an expensive lesson about what happens when a bank gets too cozy with its clients and stops asking hard questions. But here's the thing that should terrify you. This wasn't a one-off. This was a symptom of a much larger disease. Credit Suisse no longer exists. The bank that survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, multiple financial crises, the institution that had stood for 167 years,
was acquired by rival UBS in March 2023. The causes were complex, but the Greensill disaster played its part. It was one scandal in a series of catastrophic failures that destroyed confidence in the bank. The losses, the resignations, the investigations, they all added up. The mighty Credit Suisse, brought down in part by a farm boy from Bundaberg who convinced them his invoices were gold. Welcome to 21st century financial failure. It looks different from the past. It moves faster, it's wrapped in better marketing, but underneath, it's the same old story: greed, hubris, and willful blindness. Let's talk about what Greensill Capital really represents. On the surface, it was a fintech company that promised to democratize finance and help small businesses. Underneath, it was a finance company using technology as marketing, not innovation. The tech was really just software to bundle and sell receivables, something banks had been doing for centuries. But calling yourself a fintech in 2015 meant something. It meant disruption, innovation, the future. It meant regulators treated you differently, investors gave you higher valuations, and politicians wanted to associate with you. Greensill weaponized that perception. They weren't just offering supply chain finance, they were going to make finance fairer. They weren't just another lender, they were going to revolutionize how businesses access capital. The reality? They were making increasingly risky loans to a single client, packaging them up and selling them to investors who didn't understand what they were actually buying. Sound familiar? Replace supply chain finance with mortgage-backed securities, and you've got the 2008 financial crisis. Replace future receivables with collateralized debt obligations, and it's the same playbook. Take risky assets, package them in complex structures, give them official-looking credit ratings or insurance backing, sell them to investors who trust the intermediaries more than they scrutinize the underlying assets. Collect fees at every step. Hope the music keeps playing. When the music stops, everyone claims they had no idea the assets were garbage. But here's what's particularly galling about Greensill. The warning signs were everywhere, everywhere.
In 2018, 3 years before the collapse, asset manager GAM had suspended funds worth $10 billion because of concerns about investments linked to Greensill and Gupta. Lord Miners, a city grandee and former minister, publicly called for a formal investigation of Greensill's involvement in the GAM scandal. Nothing happened. German regulators at BaFin had been raising concerns about Greensill Bank's concentration risk for years. They'd warned about exposure to a single client. They'd asked for risk reduction. Greensill ignored them until it was too late. Credit insurance companies had been getting nervous about Greensill since at least 2019. They'd seen the relationships, the concentration, the questionable invoice practices. That's why Tokyo Marine eventually pulled out. Credit Suisse's own risk managers had raised concerns internally, but the investment banking side was making too much money from Greensill, and Gupta was such a good one-bank client that the warnings were overruled. Even the British Business Bank, when it accredited Greensill for the CLBIL's program, failed to conduct adequate due diligence. A National Audit Office report found they missed obvious red flags. Everyone saw the problems. Nobody wanted to be the one to stop the party. Because stopping the party means admitting you've been selling garbage. It means losses, lawsuits, reputational damage. It's easier to hope someone else notices first, or that maybe, just maybe, everything will work out fine. This is systemic failure, not one bad apple, but an entire orchard. And then there's the politics. Because Greensill wasn't just a financial scandal, it was a masterclass in how access equals influence, and influence equals money. Lex Greensill understood that in modern capitalism, the shortest path to wealth isn't building a better product, it's getting powerful people to validate your product. If you can get a prime minister on your board, if you can get a government email address, if you can get princes and chancellors returning your calls, then investors assume you're legitimate. Bankers assume you're safe. Regulators assume someone else has already done the due diligence. Greensill's relationship with David Cameron wasn't a bug, it was the entire business model. Consider the timeline. Greensill gets access to government in 2012 as an unpaid advisor. Over the next few years, he builds relationships, gets government contracts flowing through his firm, receives a CBE from Prince Charles. By the time he recruits Cameron in 2018, he's got a trophy so valuable that SoftBank invests $1.5 billion based partly on Cameron's involvement. Cameron, for his part, gets wealthy beyond most politicians' dreams. £7 million earned, options potentially worth $60 million more. Not bad for about 25 days of work per year. And what did British taxpayers get? A £335 million loss, a lobbying scandal, and a stark reminder that the revolving door between government and private sector spins smoothly and profitably if you're on the inside. The Boardman inquiry into Greensill found that the government's processes for managing conflicts of interest were inadequate, that senior civil servants had failed to properly scrutinize Greensill's role, that the rules around lobbying by former ministers needed strengthening. But here's the truth. The rules won't change. Not really, because the people who write the rules are the same people who plan to profit from those rules after they leave office. Cameron didn't break the law. He waited the required 2 years. He reported his income properly. He followed every rule. The system worked exactly as designed. That's the scandal.
As of late 2024, Sanjeev Gupta is still out there, still running GFG Alliance, still making promises about restructuring and investment. His empire is fractured. Creditors are circling. The serious fraud office investigation continues. But he hasn't gone to prison. He hasn't been convicted of anything. He continues to insist that everything will work out, that the business model is sound, that it's all just a liquidity problem. Some of his steel plants are still operating, often under administration, often losing money, but operating. Thousands of workers still depend on GFG Alliance for their livelihoods. Credit Suisse's Kroll investigation tried to track down Gupta's assets globally. They found a web of companies spread across multiple jurisdictions. Money had flowed in complex patterns between entities. Assets were hard to locate, harder to seize. The Australian Administrator's report on Gupta's Whyalla operations paints a picture of chronic underfunding, creative accounting, and business operations sustained only by constant borrowing. Without Greensill's financing, the whole structure couldn't stand. But Gupta is resilient. He's still giving interviews, still talking about his vision for sustainable steel, still promising that investigations will vindicate him. Maybe they will. Fraud is notoriously hard to prove. You need to show intent, knowledge, deliberate deception. The invoices were just aspirational is a hell of a defense. We believed the business model would work is hard to disprove. And even if prosecutors succeed, by the time trials conclude and appeals exhaust, it'll be 2027 or 2028. The money will be long gone. The empire will have crumbled. The workers will have found other jobs or given up. Justice in white-collar cases is slow, uncertain, and rarely satisfying. And what of Lex Greensill himself, the melon farmer who flew too close to the sun? He's back in Australia, living in Queensland, reportedly still wealthy despite the collapse. The shares and options that could have made him a billionaire are worthless, that he'd already taken enough off the table to be comfortable. He gave an interview to Australian media in 2021, tearful and defensive. He insisted he'd done nothing wrong, that he'd been trying to help businesses, that the collapse was due to circumstances beyond his control: COVID, insurance non-renewal, bank panic. He compared himself to Thomas Edison, saying that even great innovators face setbacks. He suggested history would vindicate him. The Swiss criminal investigation continues. If prosecutors can prove he knowingly provided false information to Credit Suisse about the quality of Gupta's receivables, he could face charges, but that's a high bar. Greensill's lawyers will argue he believed everything was legitimate, that Gupta's representatives assured him the invoices were real, that he was a victim himself. As of now, Lex Greensill hasn't been charged with any crime. He may never be. White-collar investigations take years, and proving criminal fraud, as opposed to aggressive business practices or poor judgment, is exceptionally difficult. So he'll probably avoid prison. He'll remain wealthy, and in a decade, there will be another Lex Greensill with another innovative business model that's really just the old game dressed in new clothes. The lesson we never learn. First, complexity is a feature, not a bug. The more complicated you make something, the fewer people understand it, and the easier it is to hide problems. Supply chain finance through future receivables, backed by insurance and bundled into funds marketed to wealth management clients? Most investors didn't understand what they were buying. That was the point. Second, Access is currency. Greensill's most valuable asset wasn't technology or financial innovation, it was David Cameron's phone number. That access opened every door, silenced every doubt, and made the impossible seem routine. Third, regulatory arbitrage is profitable. By positioning himself as fintech rather than a bank, by using supply chain finance rather than traditional lending, by operating across multiple jurisdictions, Greensill found gaps in oversight that he could exploit. Regulators watch the things they understand. New categories get less scrutiny. Fourth, the system protects insiders. Cameron faced political embarrassment, but no legal consequences. Greensill faces investigations, but has avoided charges. Credit Suisse executives resigned with generous severance packages. The people who actually lose in these scandals are always the ones furthest from the center: the pension fund beneficiaries, the steel workers, the taxpayers. Fifth, memory is short. Every decade brings a new financial scandal that looks novel but follows the same pattern: excessive risk, inadequate oversight, complex structures hiding simple fraud. We act shocked each time, we promise reform, then we forget, and someone does it again. The players change, the technology evolves, the buzzwords update, but the game remains the same. In November 2024, German prosecutors filed fraud charges against 2 former Credit Suisse bankers and Lex Greensill in connection with the supply chain finance scandal. The charges allege that defendants provided false information about billions of dollars worth of funds. They knew the receivables were worth substantially less than represented. They knew the risk was much higher than disclosed. The trial, if it proceeds, will take years. Greensill's lawyers will mount vigorous defenses, but the charges represent something important: an acknowledgement that this wasn't just bad business judgment, it was alleged fraud. Whether prosecutors can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt is another question. Stand outside the building where Greensill Capital once had its offices. It's occupied by another company now. The sign has changed. Life moves on. But if you know where to look, you can still see the ghosts. The German councils that invested in Greensill Bank, thinking they were making safe deposits, still haven't recovered all their money. The legal proceedings drag on. The Credit Suisse clients, whose wealth was trapped in suspended funds, have gotten some money back, but not all of it. The recovery rate was around 70-80 cents on the dollar. If you'd invested 10 million, you lost 2 or 3 million. That kind of loss changes retirements, changes lives. The British taxpayers are still owed hundreds of millions from those CLBILS loans to Gupta's companies. The government hopes to recover some of it through asset sales and legal proceedings, but nobody expects full recovery. The steelworkers in Whyalla, in Fort William, across Europe, they've lived through years of uncertainty. Will the plant stay open? Will there be investment? Will we have jobs next year? Some plants have found new owners, some have closed. All of them bear scars. And the politicians? David Cameron gave a few embarrassed interviews and went back to his private life. His wealth intact, his reputation dented but not destroyed. He'll be remembered more for Brexit than Greensill. The system continues unchanged. The revolving door still spins. The next Lex Greensill is out there right now, probably calling himself a fintech innovator, probably cultivating relationships with powerful people, probably building a business model that's more marketing than substance. Because here's the dirty secret: Greensill Capital worked. Not for investors, not for taxpayers, not for workers, but it worked for the people who mattered. Lex Greensill became wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. David Cameron made millions. Sanjeev Gupta lived like a billionaire for years. Credit Suisse bankers collected bonuses throughout the good years. SoftBank wrote off the investment and moved on to the next big thing. The people who created the disaster walked away largely unscathed. The people who suffered the consequences had no say in creating it. That's not a bug in the system. That's the system working exactly as intended. So when someone tells you about the next revolutionary fintech company that's going to democratize finance and help small businesses and change the world, ask yourself, who's really getting rich here? Who's taking the risk? And when this house of cards falls, who's going to be left holding the bag? Because it will fall. They always do. The melon farmer from Bundaberg taught us that. He built his empire on invoices that didn't exist, relationships that corrupted, and faith that lasted just long enough for him to cash out. The house of credit cards stood tall for a decade. Billions flowed through it. Fortunes were made. Politicians posed for photos. Bankers celebrated deals. Then one day, someone pulled a card from the foundation, and the entire structure came tumbling down in a matter of days. The wreckage is still smoldering. The investigations continue. The lessons remain unlearned. Somewhere in Queensland, a man who once had matching private jets with a steel magnet sits by a pool, perhaps thinking about what went wrong, or perhaps thinking about his next venture. Somewhere in London, Credit Suisse's old headquarters are now branded UBS, a bank that survived 167 years erased in a weekend, partially because they believed a farm boy story about making finance fairer. And somewhere in a government building, a civil servant is probably having lunch with an entrepreneur who has a revolutionary idea and just needs a little access, a small introduction, a brief conversation with a minister.
The game continues. The players change. The house of cards gets rebuilt. If you enjoyed this story, please share and subscribe for more.